MBTI isn't your identity, but I understand why it might feel like it is. When the world hasn't given you a clear place, when your difference has always felt like a flaw, then finding a four-letter code that finally explains your internal logic can feel like salvation. For many, it's the first mirror that reflects anything coherent. That moment matters. It's real. But that mirror, if clung to too tightly, can become a mask. What once revealed you begins to contain you. Not because MBTI is wrong, or shallow or dangerous, but because any framework becomes dangerous when we stop evolving inside it. And when that evolution is challenged, when someone dares to say you're not your type, some people get angry. That anger isn't immaturity, it's protection, and it deserves to be understood before it's undone. MBTI was never designed to define your soul. It was built to map psychological preferences, patterns in how we take in information, how we process it, how we relate to the world. At its best, it gives language to what was once ineffable. But language is a double-edged thing. The moment we name a pattern, we risk reducing the mystery behind it. And when a label brings relief, it's easy to confuse that relief with truth. Many people don't cling to MBTI because they're rigid. They cling because it offered structure at a time when they had none. But if we don't know when to loosen our grip, comfort becomes confinement. MBTI is a map, but the map is not the territory. Your type might describe how your mind prefers to move, but it does not describe your essence. And it was never meant to. When a system becomes sacred, it stops serving you. And many people today are worshiping the map while forgetting to walk the path. Let's be precise. Psychological type, in the Jungian tradition, isn't chaos. It has structure. It describes stable orientations of consciousness, like introverted intuition or extroverted thinking, and those structures tend to persist. Jung believed we each begin life-oriented around one dominant function. That doesn't change. But what can change, what must change, is our relationship to what we've left behind. Jung didn't ask us to discard our type. He asked us to confront its opposite, to integrate what we've neglected. So when I say you might outgrow the box you mistook for yourself, I don't mean you stop being who you are. I mean you stop mistaking who you prefer to be for all that you are. The goal isn't type switching, it's psychic integration. And that's not betrayal of Jung's vision. It's the very heart of it. Let me tell you a story. Someone I know once spent years believing they were an INTP. It made sense. They were analytical, withdrawn, obsessed with ideas. They avoided conflict, stayed in their head, and lived in a mental workshop of infinite refinement. The description fit, at least on paper. But when life turned confrontational, something broke, or maybe something broke open. Under pressure, they didn't retreat. They executed, they confronted. They moved with frightening clarity, as if something had been waiting all along. And that's when the truth started surfacing. They weren't an INTP who had learned to act. They were an INTJ who had learned to hide. What looked like tiny was actually a shadow loop, a defensive cycle where the psyche relies on unconscious functions to preserve control and avoid vulnerability. Phi protecting their integrity, Tai protecting their clarity, while their true cognitive architecture, Nite, was buried beneath early social suppression. They weren't passive, they were preparing. And the moment they stopped confusing early camouflage for their core, their entire system reorganized. Not by changing types, but by reclaiming the architecture that had been there all along. Jung warned us, early ego identity often forms around what protects us, not what defines us. He made this painfully clear. The ego is nothing other than a bundle of personal memories and perceptions shaped by the environment and adapted to it. So we learn to behave, to please, to survive. We build masks that help us belong, and those masks become so effective, so habitual, that we start confusing them for who we are. The persona, Jung wrote, is partially dictated by society and partially by our own need to protect ourselves. It's not identity, it's defense. And underneath it all, beneath the strategy and survival, is the one truth we fear the most. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. We survive through auxiliary or shadow functions when the dominant one is unsafe to express. And if you've ever felt like you were a type that no longer fits, it might not be because you're changing. It might be because you're emerging. Let's be fair to the system itself. MBTI isn't the villain. It doesn't demand worship. It doesn't tell you to shrink. It simply describes. The problem isn't MBTI, it's how we relate to it. Every framework, when pulled into culture, becomes distorted. And MBTI has become more than a psychological model. It's become a form of identity shorthand, a social badge, a justification toolkit. People say I'm an INTJ, not just to communicate preference, but to explain behavior, or worse, to excuse it. That's not the system's fault, but it is our responsibility to notice when a useful language has turned into a limiting story. Most people don't cling to MBTI because they understand it deeply. They cling because it gave them the first answer that made their internal world make sense, and then they stopped asking further questions. That's what I'm challenging. Not the model, but the psychic inertia. Because when a model becomes a mirror, and the mirror becomes a mask, we stop growing. And Jung's entire psychology was built on this truth. The soul doesn't want to be explained. It wants to be integrated. And MBTI, used well, can support that. But used unconsciously, it replaces the very journey it was meant to begin. We have to honor what MBTI gives people. For many, discovering their type wasn't intellectual, it was emotional. It explained what no one else could name. It made loneliness make sense. It gave people a map when they were lost in a forest of contradiction. That first resonance, the feeling of being seen, is not something to belittle. It's a real developmental milestone. But like all scaffolding, it's meant to be temporary. You can't transcend what you've never stabilized. And MBTI offers that stability. But the danger is when the scaffolding becomes the ceiling. When you start living for the type, curating your behavior to match the profile, fearing anything that contradicts it, you stop becoming. Jung understood this deeply. He didn't give us typology to build an identity. He gave it to us to recognize what we were ignoring. Your dominant function isn't your truth. It's your tendency. The work is integrating its opposite, not to erase what you are, but to become what you could be. So what do you do with your type? You honor it. You study it. You use it to stabilize your sense of self, but never to finalize it. Jung gave you a compass, not a destination, and it's your job to walk beyond the familiar terrain it first revealed. MBTI is useful. It's structured, accessible, and for many, it's the first time their mind felt like it had a place in the world. That matters, and Jung laid the groundwork for that map. But let's not confuse the original vision with what culture did to it. Jung's typology was never meant to categorize people permanently. It was meant to help them see where they begin and where they resist becoming whole. Individuation isn't about shedding your type. It's about integrating what your type avoids. That was Jung's work. This video simply adds a layer, reminding you that the system built to liberate the psyche can, in the wrong hands, become a mask the psyche hides behind. So no, this video wasn't made to tear down MBTI. It was made to protect you from collapsing into it. Because when a system that was meant to guide you begins to define you, you've lost the very freedom the system was designed to support. You don't need to reject your type, but you do need to stop mistaking it for the whole story. If this video unsettled you, that's not an attack. It's an opening. Because the self doesn't begin where you're most certain. It begins where you start to question what you've made sacred. Maybe your type helped you survive. Maybe it still helps you explain. But if there's even a part of you, quiet, distant, intuitive, that wonders whether there's more to you than this pattern, then this is the place where that wondering becomes work. This channel isn't here to type you. It's here to mirror you and to confront the parts of you that your type couldn't explain. Subscribe, not because it helps the algorithm, but because you're ready to move forward. Not from your type, but through it. You're not here to be categorized. You're here to become.